This podcast is intended for a mature audience and might be offensive or triggering for some listeners. If you struggle with persistent feelings of fear, sadness, anger, or anxiety, I urge you to confront those feelings with the guidance of a trained trauma-focused therapist. And if at any time you experience intrusive thoughts of hurting yourself or others, call 911 or a local crisis hotline immediately. Welcome back to the madness of the Midnight Sun. Today, we're asking the difficult question of what happens when inherited trauma influences behavior, perception, and emotional regulation, and why these questions matter when we talk about violence, accountability, and survival. We're joined by Dr. Nathaniel Harnett, Director of the Neurobiology of Affective and Traumatic Experiences Laboratory at McLean Hospital, and an Assistant Professor in Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Last time Dr. Harnett was on the show, he explained how trauma can echo across generations, how stress experienced by a parent can leave biological and behavioral tracks that can break trail for the direction of their children's path. It's a concept that reframes trauma not as a single event, but as something that can quietly shape families, communities, and identities over time.
Transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, it's called. So it's the idea that there's biological imprinting for very stressful events that are then detectable in offspring. So there's like good rodent model research showing that, for example, trace fear memory. So if you have mice that learn to pair an odor with an aversive event, you stress them out, that gets passed from the father to the offspring, and then that offspring shows altered fear responses above and beyond sort of the untrained parent dyads. And then there's also good evidence from Rachel Yehuda, who was studying Holocaust survivors and Dutch famine survivors, that those individuals who went through these very stressful events have certain epigenetic tags that were then detectable in their children. So it's this idea that not just through the sort of cultural or, verbal behavioral transmission that you might expect to get from your parents, you can also get this sort of like biological proclivity or predisposition.
If a child is exposed to that and they're coming into the world predisposed to like PTSD-like symptoms or having higher cortisol rates or whatever, do you think those sensitivities typically fade with development, or do you think that person probably is likely to have that elevated range throughout their life? And do we know what makes the difference?
I think it depends. I think it depends on what is the developmental environment, or what does the developmental environment look like. It's certainly the case that, and I want to be careful about predisposition language, even though I've already used it, so I've kind of set you up to let me say this. If only because I think we often think about predisposition as you've had this thing happen, so now you have this brain and you will have this behavior. The reality is that brain sort of connection to behavior isn't always one-to-one. In fact, it's more like you have this sort of network configuration that allows for this repertoire of behaviors. And so it's not necessarily that you will experience this and then you will do this. I'm not a bioessentialist or a biodeterminist. It's more that there's an increased likelihood or restriction of possible outcomes or expansion of possible outcomes depending on what your developmental environment looks like. And so if you have these individuals, or if you're an individual that was exposed to trauma as a child, or your parent was exposed to trauma, and that's been passed down either through sort of a psychological, behavioral, or biological mechanism, that doesn't mean that like you are destined to have PTSD. It doesn't mean you are destined to become your parents. What it means is that we have to figure out what the environmental changes are, what the behavioral changes are, what things we need to modify to minimize specifically for you the chances that you're going to go on to develop those adverse outcomes.
You've spent all these years stuck in the past instead of letting it go and living your life.
I think that the way that you're able to weave your personal experience with like some of the core foundational issues with trauma that we don't often think about is also really cool. Like one of the things that comes out in the first couple episodes is just like the anger, right? The anger, the aggression, just the raw emotionality. that we know is related to trauma and PTSD, but we don't often think about. Because I think a lot of times when we talk about trauma, we think, not to sort of belittle the experience, but like, oh, something bad happens, people get sad and they have these reactions, and that's unfortunate. But like the way that people respond to trauma, and I think that you capture, can be very variable, can be very varied. And some people develop these very sort of aggressive and hostile and external, what we call externalizing sort of tendencies, especially after someone's been through what they call chronic social defeat stress. The way that we think about PTSD versus complex PTSD in a sort of colloquial sense, as much as anyone sort of colloquially talks about PTSD, right, is that, we have these criterion for PTSD, these intrusive memories or flashbacks that people often think about, hyperarousal symptoms, negative alterations in cognition and mood, and avoidance symptoms. These are sort of classical domains, or the domains of sort of classical PTSD. Whereas for complex PTSD, again, we're really trying to get at this sort of clinical phenotype or clinical expression of behaviors and cognitions that are associated with the sort of repeated, prolonged exposure to aversive or traumatic events. And so when we're talking about individuals who experienced long-term child abuse, who grew up in these impoverished areas around substance abuse and so on and so forth, I think that there's a higher preponderance of those individuals who go on to develop these sort of symptoms of complex PTSD, which are associated with these sort of aspects of excessive emotional reactivity, and things that I think as if you don't mind me saying, you're probably more of the expert on this and on your experiences than I am before I start talking about them. In fact, if you don't mind, do you mind sharing a little bit about, how you think about PTSD versus complex PTSD?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because I think I've experienced both, right? Like I had definitely some experiences growing up that were very significant and trauma-inducing, from being physically assaulted and nearly dying right there on the floor. You know what I mean? That definitely afterwards gave me some PTSD symptoms. I also had some other traumatic things happen where, for a period of time after that, I would have night sweats. My dreams got worse. I mean, I would even just going to bed, be like so stressed out and just, you know what I mean? Like I wouldn't be able, I had a terrible insomnia growing up. It would give me migraines, all these things. I just felt overloaded. Now, those symptoms would fade after a while, until something else would sometimes trigger that to come back. Something else, would happen that would kind of make those kind of immediate symptoms start again. The migraines, the night terrors, all those things. And then I went through a period, and I do think I probably had complex PTSD as a teenager because a lot was going on then. But in my early 20s is when it really started to ramp up. Most of my PTSD, like those direct symptoms of migraines, I still had them sometimes, but not. I mean, I was having them as a kid, like once or twice a week. I mean, debilitating migraines. Like couldn't go to school, had to cover my eyes, no light. I would throw up. The pain, it was so intense.
Oh, wow.
Like once or twice a week, and that started to fade in my 20s. But then I started going through a series of losses, and some of those losses were traumatic in themselves. How some people who were close to me died, and what they represented to me in sort of my schema of like who I was and where my life was going, all that. And anytime, especially with death, right, with grief, grief is like this hall pass to go a little crazy for a short period of time, to have sort of, trauma. I mean, losing somebody who's close to you is traumatic. During this period in my early 20s, I started losing a lot of people in short succession. So before I was totally over grieving someone else, and then something else, and then someone else again, and then something else, and then and before I could ever really get whole again, something else would knock me on my butt, and that's where I just, it wasn't just about migraines. Those symptoms came back too, but it was more just constantly feeling hypervigilant, constantly feeling angry and, you know what I mean? Like resentful at life, you know, and just not trusting that things would ever feel okay again. It was disturbing to feel like that was taking me over. And that is where, you know, I was already actively trying to write my memoirs and fictionize them to tell this story and this experience I had. And I broke down and said, you know, is this just really a story about mental illness and that I'm sick, you know, that I need to, you know, that's what I really need to be focusing on. And that was really scary to admit to myself. And it took years of work to start to unpack all that and to finally, you know, learn what CPTSD even was. And once I did, it was like, oh my God, like this makes so much more sense. Like it's like I'm, you know, a textbook example of this. And that allowed me to start taking some of my power back and like I said before, once you can see it and you can hold on to that and you can remind yourself, hey, you know, this is what this, you know, what you're feeling right now, you're okay. This is what's going on. Forgive yourself, forgive your brain, cut yourself some slack. You know, I started to be able to relax, put it down a little bit, and kind of like lessen that shame of like, hey, it's not that I'm so broken or there's something so wrong with me. This could happen to anyone. This machine we have, you know, it's like, hey, something put sugar in your gas tank. You know what I mean? You didn't do it. It's not your fault. So I just never felt like myself again. I never got a chance to. And then after that, it took a long time to really trust that I could.
I think something you said really struck me. I have a mentor here at McLean, Melissa Kaufman, and she has a quote sitting in her office. And I think her other collaborator, one of my collaborators, Lauren LeBlanc, also has one. It's this quote from Mary Rockow that goes, I believe, sometimes to be seen is the same as being saved. And I think that in a lot of ways, when we're talking about PTSD, when we're talking about trauma, when we're talking about trauma treatment, that is like a huge part of this. Again, to survive in the world that we live in, you sometimes have to just form these associations, figure out how to get to the next day, and then you do it over and over and over again. And you forget, either consciously, non-consciously, deliberately, why you form these associations in the first place. And especially when you think about adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma and trauma that happens really in those formative years when you're learning how to interact with the world around you, you've developed all of these sort of adaptive, behavioral, and cognitive coping mechanisms just to get through the next day. And then what happens, much like soldiers returning from war, when you're then pushed out into the rest of the world and you have to form relationships, you have to form attachments, you have to manage those relationships and attachments, you have to figure out how to go to work. How do all of those ways you've learned to cope then manifest in, I don't know, how'd you call it, normal society with the biggest rabbit ears I can find? It's tough, right? And it's tough to try to push that down and then try to find a way to come back later. And it's scary. It's terrifying to have to put a label and a term and like acknowledge like this thing happened to me. Sorry, I know I just cut you off a little bit.
Oh, I was going to say, how did I learn to cope?
Yeah.
Let me think. Because, you know, I mean, no, but seriously, like I've been a smoker since I was 14, you know, and thanks, Dad. You know what I mean? Gave me my first cigarette, bonding, right? Trauma bonding, you know, just these unhealthy ways of coping. That's how he coped. That's how I learned how to cope. I mean, but it's dark humor, I know, but it's, you know, it's so common. And for me, I would get really anxious in social settings because of the reasons you just said. You know, I've always felt different, and I've always felt like I've had to mask, and we all mask a little bit. We mask when we have to go to a job or school or whatever, but you know, there's so much. I didn't feel like I could get close to colleagues or have friends who I didn't have, who didn't know about my history. You know, I just couldn't let anyone in. And smoking, nicotine, man, became my instant medication of, you know, kind of neutralizing that anxiety. And it gave me an excuse to step out of whatever it was, the party, the film festival, the whatever, and get away. And, you know, so often, you're going to rub shoulders with someone else who's out there doing that. And chances are they're probably stepping out for similar reasons. And then it was always easier to connect with that person outside. Right. But now that I'm in my 40s, I'm vaping now, but it's still terrible for you. It's not healthy. I feel it, and I'm getting older. And I'm like, I gotta stop coping with my anxiety with nicotine because it's eating me from the inside out. And if I put this down, this lifelong coping thing down, boy, I'm gonna have to really come up with some new strategies. I can say this all day that I'm aware of this wiring I have, that I can give myself affirmations, but I really need to embrace those tools because I'm scared to death to quit. I'm scared of what my brain will do when that trauma trigger happens. That's what I've always done. And without that, who am I, Nate? You know what I mean?
That's the $1 million question. Like, who am I? What are we doing here? I think you're catching something that a lot of people learn relatively late to the game. It's so, listen, I'm just going to be completely, I'm not doing the professor thing. I'm just being completely real with you. It is so difficult to remember that you are just like a meat bag with some squishy meat that controls you walking around, because we all have this sort of sense of who we are. And we're like, yeah, I'm in control of the situation. I'm in control of this skeletal meat bag body moving through on this like spinning rock in outer space. And the reality is, like, there's so much that we're just not consciously processing day to day. And the ways in which we cope is often one of them. Like, I don't think that personally everyone always makes the decision of like, I'm going to go do this unhealthy thing because of this thing that happened in my past. It's more, again, that associative learning of like, for me, has been probably for as long as I can not control it, salty and sugary food, right? If I'm feeling stressed out, I'm grabbing a bag of chips, I'm grabbing a chocolate, I'm grabbing like something sweet, and I'm going to eat it, and I'm going to feel terrible like 10 minutes later, but I'll feel a different kind of terrible than I felt, 5 minutes before that. And it took me a long time and a lot of therapy to understand that, like, that's part of the coping mechanism. That's not the only coping mechanism, right? There's other things that I won't give up, like video games or things like that. But it's just part of what we do as humans is we look for these sort of external ways of mitigating our internal feelings. It's something that we develop very early on, and it gets very difficult, especially when we're talking about these traumatic events, these stressful events, when we're talking about the specific things that you've encountered. It's very hard. And part of the reason I bring up my colleagues, Dr. Kaufman and Dr. Lebois, is they do work on dissociative disorders and the dissociative subtype of PTSD. And one of the things that we know about the dissociative subtype of PTSD and these sort of dissociative experiences is that by their very nature, they are a very complex way of coping with, what we might call extreme trauma, right? Child abuse, other types of things that violate bodily autonomy. People go through these or enact these behaviors of depersonalization, this idea of sort of separating what's happening from you, this idea that it's not me that this traumatic event is happening to, or derealization of sort of feeling like you're floating above your body. You're like, the example that they give is like, imagine you're on a roller coaster and you sort of move out of your body and you're watching it happen from the ground, but you're not really saying, that's not me on the roller coaster. And that gets at some parts of things that we all sort of naturally do. Some people, when they listen to me talk, I can see that they're totally spaced out. They're not really with me in the moment. Maybe I've said something that's very boring to them. I think I'm very entertaining and lovely, so I don't know why they would do that. But sometimes people space out. That's a very dissociative process. Like, you've somehow managed to tune out all the external stimuli around you. Like, just imagine how impressive that is. If you have earphones in, or there's like a talk with a microphone, it's like loud. Like, you should be able to hear this. And yet somehow we're all able to do this thing where we just sort of tune the volume down and we're not paying attention to this thing in our environment anymore. And it's really impressive how the brain is able to do these weird cognitive tricks to protect us from, in the case of some of my students, something that might be very boring, or in the case of what a lot of us go through, very stressful or highly traumatic experiences that, frankly, we don't want to deal with at that moment.
Right. Yeah. I've definitely felt that depersonalization that you're talking about, and that is a weird thing. If you've never experienced it, it's hard to even imagine. But I've met other people who've experienced a lot of trauma in childhood who sometimes get that too, and it's such a weird sensation, man. For me, like, I'm in such a loving, healthy, safe relationship and am living my best life. Like I said, as with someone with CPTSD, that in itself can sometimes be triggering because I'm worried about losing all that. It's hard. But there are times where I've had these moments where I feel like it's unreal. Like, is this real life? Like, did I die and this is just my ghost not realizing I'm in my own dream? Like, it's just, it's hard to describe, but it's a weird feeling to feel like you're not really you in you sometimes. It's not a constant thing. And I've only felt it a few times, but it is a very weird phenomena.
Yeah.
Is somebody with CPTSD more likely to be violent? I'm not a doctor, man, but Nate is.
Do you think that somebody who's predispositioned, to have, or they have PTSD or CPTSD, any of these kinds of things, do you think that they are more likely to act out violently, become somebody who, just because of that heightened stress and all that, they're more likely to fall, to patterns of violence themselves?
Yeah, I want to be careful about how I respond to this, if only because I don't want to say that if you experience trauma, you're going to become violent, right? That's not the direct one-to-one association that I want to make. There is good associative evidence to suggest that among some individuals, high levels of stress, high levels of trauma are associated with more emotion dysregulation. In fact, emotion dysregulation is really what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma and stress-related disorders. And that might come through more sort of internalizing symptoms, as sort of negative alterations in cognition and mood, the avoidance symptoms, or it might come out in more externalizing behaviors, more sort of aggressive, maybe more violent behaviors. Again, I don't think that it's deterministic. I don't think that you will necessarily become a violent individual. I think that individuals find different ways to cope with the traumas that they've experienced. I think that's part of what we see in the case of complex PTSD, where you have these things, you have all these emotions, they need to go somewhere. You can't possibly hold all of them. They have to come out. But if you try to hold them in, forever and a day, they're going to come out. If you've ever sort of, taken a hose and cranked it so that nothing's going to come out, it's going to bulge, and eventually it's all going to come out at once. And I think that's often what we think about and what we see in individuals who are having these sort of explosive events. I can remember if you're, for example, a child and that's how your parents or your caregivers interact with you, that's a period of time where you're learning how to adapt to the world around you. And if the way that the world is showing you, hey, the way that you survive is by being aggressive, by attacking other people, at some level, those are the types of adaptive mechanism that kids are sort of developing. And so it's not a surprise that as they get older, those sort of same behaviors start to come out. They start to affect their other relationships. And that's one way in which sort of trauma perpetuates itself throughout the lifespan. But I don't think that people are destined to become very violent with that. And I think that's the point I want to make here, is that people react in different ways, people cope in different ways, and it's a matter of figuring out how do we find them the resources that they need so that they don't have these sort of extreme reactions on one end or the other. So when we're talking about changes in the environment, things like, again, increasing access to basic resources, increasing access to nutritious food, finding different support programs for any sort of emotional behavioral health issues that you might have. All of these things that we can do to intervene early to sort of give you the best chance and mitigate against these sort of early stressful environments. Yes, I think that if you have individuals that have these sort of early childhood traumatic stressors and they go on to have more stressors in adulthood, they experience more traumatic events, the likelihood of PTSD, the likelihood of more severe PTSD, of complex PTSD is all going to go up. But that isn't that should not be this sort of defeatist mindset of, well, it's going to happen to them. There are things we can do to minimize that.
What from your perspective, what kind of interventions or policies could help reduce both the individual and societal costs of trauma?
I know it's become a little bit of a meme in the field at this point, but for what it's worth, I really do think that trauma-informed practices are just very good things to have, if not for like the ethical and moral reason, but also for like the scientific value add, right? So when we're talking about trauma informed, we're talking about principles based in the understanding that people have trauma. People have experienced trauma. People bring that trauma with them to the other events in their lives. And so having recognition of that, developing practices, and there are several, I think, fairly good ones that are well evidence-based at this point, can be included in sort of outreach programs and community outreach and things like that. I think that one of the big things from my perspective, as I've been thinking about this for a long time, is how do we sort of, and this is another sort of meme phrase, but how do we increase resilience? So if you look at associations between adverse childhood experiences or trauma exposure and development of PTSD symptoms, you tend to see the same thing. More childhood trauma is associated with higher likelihood of PTSD or more severe PTSD symptoms, or sort of more or greater prevalence of other types of adverse health behaviors like engaging in substance use or problematic alcohol use. But if you have sort of higher levels of what we call resilience, which is really sort of like internal feelings of coping, which you get from high social support, from living in neighborhoods where you have the resources to take care of your basic needs and then some, those aspects of resilience almost universally moderate this relationship. And what that means is that if you have higher levels of internal or external resources, you have lower risk, you have lower severity in response to sort of greater levels of burden. So individuals with higher levels of childhood adversity show lower, not necessarily lower, but lower than they would PTSD levels if they're also living in environments where they have access to resources, where they have things that can promote resilience. And so for me, thinking about how to, especially for young children, you alleviate some burden for parents. How do you address sort of economical issues? How do you address sort of the things that they're dealing with that then they take home? I mean, transgenerational transmission of these sort of PTSD-like phenotypes is such a big thing, especially when we're talking about youth. I think we often think about, well, kids are experiencing trauma and we have to treat the kids. That's totally true, and I'm totally on board. But they're getting and experiencing that stress and trauma from someplace. And often they're getting it from parents who, in many ways, I think mean well, but they have their own sort of stressors, their own types of things that they're dealing with. And without the resources to be able to grapple with that, I think as you might be sort of experiencing, I think as many of us have experienced as we've gone to therapy, it's really hard to not then spread that down to our other relationships, down to people that depend on us, and trying to stop that sort of vicious cycle of you experience trauma, you pass it on, and then they have children and they pass it on, is one of the big things, I think, in terms of trying to mitigate these sort of downstream deleterious consequences. We should fix poverty within the United States. We should not have this sort of extreme wealth and economic resource gap between individuals. It is, in many ways, patently absurd to know that having people's basic needs met is one of the most fundamental things for addressing mental health, getting them out of situations, out of environments where they are likely to experience adverse childhood experiences or trauma. And we could address that. We could simply address that by pumping resources, pumping money, transforming the environments that people live in. And it's weird to me that we don't just do that, especially when we know what the economic and social and political consequences of not doing that for individuals are. It's one thing I just don't understand.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I really think that once some person accumulates so much wealth that they're going to become a billionaire, I think they should get a trophy that says, "Congratulations, you won capitalism. Every dollar you make from that is going to these social programs that will help with these kind of issues that are so widespread." You know what I mean? And then you should be thought of as a hero instead of
Yeah.
just lording all this money. Yeah. Anyway, we could
And
go on
no,
and on.
I we could. Well, I think it's important. It's like, how do I say this in a very like thoughtful way? Obviously, like therapy is very important. It's super important. We should all be doing it. Behavioral health problems are also very important. But there is an element of all of this that is sort of placeholder for economic upward mobility. It is a lot easier, and I can say this as someone who's gone, and maybe you experience this as well, as someone who's gone from like living in very low economic bracket to like slowly moving up a little bit. You know, I'm not rich, but I've now experienced what poverty looks like and what not poverty looks like. And my mental health and my ability to engage with my mental health, quite frankly, has just seen leaps and exponential growth as a function of this upward economic mobility. It is wild to me how much healthier and how much happier I became once like very basic, nutrition and other sorts of needs were met. If you think about that hierarchy of needs pyramid from Maslow, where it's like basic needs and then social needs and all the way up to self-actualization, it is wild to me that is very, very true. Like you really do need those basic needs. And yet, as a society, as a community, we've been very bad about saying, hey, these individuals who are experiencing a lot of trauma, we should try meeting some of their needs first and see if that might address like this really rampant public health issue.
Like it's a lot more common than people realize. It's a big part of our population that this impacts. And
Yeah. So it's
and
like,
that's just people we know. How many people are just, you know what I mean, holding it in, and you don't have any idea until something happens, you know?
yeah. So the unfortunate numbers are that every single year there are about 30 million individuals who are admitted to emergency apartments across the country, right? That is larger than the state of Texas. And those are for potentially traumatic events. And that is just like potential medical trauma, right? So they could have been in a car accident, they could have been in a high fall, a burn, anything that meets the sort of DSM-5, holy psychiatric Bible of what counts as trauma. That doesn't include ACEs, which, as you know, there's traumatic events, and then there are ACEs, which are potentially traumatic, but can involve things like being around substance use, growing up in a neglectful household, being around poverty, or just witnessing violence. And so when you take all those into account, I don't think we really know how many people every single year are experiencing at least one ACE, and many of them are going to experience two or more. So when we talk about sort of the prevalence of trauma, I think related to the work that you're doing, where people aren't thinking about it, we don't, ironically, I think outside of the trauma space, we don't talk enough about it, that people understand like these are really common, and that when people like you are willing to speak up, you find that, a lot of people realize, oh, right. That was fucked up what happened to me. Like we should probably process that. That might have impacted how I interact with people now. Well, I think like the 2018 estimates dollars that we had were something like $200 billion in productivity cost loss to civilian PTSD. That's not including military veterans or those employees in war zones. That's like car accidents, assaults, and the like. And that's just like healthcare, productivity loss, things like that. You add in sort of the cost to society for ACEs or childhood trauma, the cost to society for military trauma. It's astronomical. And like, it seems like a big price tag when you talk about preventative strategies or like early intervention strategies. But the reality,
look at the big picture.
The reality of the situation is that the math probably works out that we would save money by trying to address PTSD and trauma issues before. I mean, I don't want to make I don't think it's a perfect comparison, but one of the issues that we had for years and years and years with developmentally were kids getting peanut allergies. And the biggest thing that they did was say you should expose kids to peanuts early and often. And lo and behold, peanut allergies have been going down since then. I mean, I think when you purposely try to do early interventions, purposely try to provide resources while people are learning how to live their lives, you're likely to get good outcomes. Quite frankly, money would solve a lot of problems when it comes to trying to get therapy. And it turns out, that sort of socio-environmental context, that sort of resource availability of the neighborhoods you live in, that also plays a pretty big role in terms of how likely you are to recover from a traumatic event, how likely you are to just be resilient later on. And it seems to be associated with changes in brain function and structure in the regions that we know are really important for PTSD development. And so I think that for me personally, it's been a lot of self-reflection. There's been a little bit of me search, and it's really been about trying to understand what the hell is going on with our environment that leads us to have these reactions, and how do we think about adjusting both the environment and just providing resources to people so that we don't have those responses anymore, so that we don't have PTSD and this pie in the sky world, right? Which I think we can all aspire and dream to, the best version of society that we can. How do we just get rid of PTSD? Accepting that we can try to get rid of trauma. We can try to do that as much as possible. And I think we can be successful in many ways. But how do we stop people from getting to that next point of they've developed this psychiatric disorder? How do we figure out intervening at the brain, at the body, and the societal level to prevent those types of things from developing? That's been really the core focus of a lot of what I've been doing.
I love that, man. And also, how do we get people to have empathy for people who are on that precipice of needing to do that work? Because I think that's a big part of it too. And it all comes down to that stigma, right? For the individual to even accept that maybe they should look at this and actually go on that journey to, people understanding that it's okay to do that and not to, think of someone as lesser for that, that it's not a defect in them, it's something that happened to them in the environment and all those things if we could embrace that. Nate, we're out of time, but man, there are so many more questions I just love to, ask you. Thank you so much for coming on the show with us today and getting this conversation started.
No, I really appreciate you having me, and I really appreciate, the sort of efforts that you're taking to educate people on trauma, on ACEs, on PTSD, and, sharing your story with all of us so that, we have sort of a frame of reference and an ability to think more clearly about how does this relate to the things that we might have experienced and how do we look for different areas for help.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
If you feel you or someone you care about may be living with the effects of traumatic stress, you're not alone. Please visit the resource page at crookedpictures.com for more information and support. Until next time, thanks for opening your mind. I hope it helped shed a little light into your heart.